In September 2023, trailers and showcases in Sony's PlayStation State of Play stream and the Square Enix's stage presentation at Tokyo Game Show were treating Final Fantasy VII fans to a fancy 5-star dinner. Not to mention, hands-on impressions through a demo preview many influencers and the game's media got to play and present a few days before Tokyo Game Show 2023. Besides the world, more about the combat, and even menus, we received glimpses on several minigames present in Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. 9 in total, to be exact, with one of them being somewhat novel, and another one that's a completely new addition to the Final Fantasy VII universe. Greetings, fellow scholars of the livestream. I'm Kutakuma from the Cosmo Observatory, and in today's analysis, we'll take a detailed look at Final Fantasy VII Rebirth's original minigame, Queen's Blood, and find out how it plays, what its rules are, and how its design could be a parallel to the main story. Keep in mind that this analysis was first published on our CCO Substack on September 27, 2023, and continually expanded upon by the other 8 minigames revealed thus far, which we'll cover in upcoming videos to keep each one at a digestible length. So make sure to subscribe to this channel and hit the notification bell if you haven't already, so you don't miss out on gems like Chocobo Racing, Moogle Mischief, and Piano Performance. So, without further ado, strap in and get ready. This is going to be a juicy one. Also, usual warning, there are going to be spoilers for Final Fantasy VII Remake and, of course, the original game. This minigame is completely new to the Final Fantasy VII universe and was specifically created for Rebirth. One would think it might tie into its larger narrative because of that, but that's for later. First, let's check out official information about it. In an interview from September 22nd, 2023, published on the Square Enix blog, director Naoki Hamaguchi was asked about his personal favorite minigame, and this was his response. Out of all of the different minigames available, the card game, Queen's Blood, can be said to be one of the headliners. It's an in-world card game that is very popular in the world of Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, and a minigame that can be played many times from the start of your adventure to the end. Winning matches doesn't just let you enhance your deck, you can also follow a unique Queen's Blood story as well. The narrative progresses as you engage more challenges in matches. There are 3 interesting takeaways from this. First, like Fort Condor in episode Intermission, it's an in-world game that's popular among the people living in the current game's world. Midgar in episode Intermission, and the whole planet in Rebirth. This heavily reminds of other card games in the franchise like Triple Triad in Final Fantasy VIII, or even Tetramaster in Final Fantasy IX. Second, it appears to be available throughout the whole journey. We hope that we can play against Sephiroth at some point. Third, playing against more and more rivals, you'll progress through a side story tied to this minigame. This sounds very exciting and makes winning and finding new cards and playing numerous matches even more rewarding. Another Square Enix blog post provides a short description of this minigame, but reveals barely anything new save for the main goal and winning conditions. Queen's Blood is a strategic card game that has skyrocketed to popularity. Players take turns placing cards on the board in an attempt to overpower their opponent by accumulating power in each lane. Collect cards and utilize their abilities to claim the crown as QB royalty. We know what it is about and how it looks like, but what are the rules and how does it play like? Let's find out. Before we can even begin to play, we need to seek out so-called rivals. Like in episode Intermission, each rival has their own level as indicated on the compass, minimap, and most likely on a rival's head too, though we weren't able to find any example of that in the existing footage. However, the trailer exclusive to the Tokyo Game Show stage showcase provides us with a view on such a rival sitting in front of her Queen's Blood setup, which does not just contain the board, but boasts a miniature castle front towering over the game board. When starting up a game, the camera briefly pans over said castle front, setting scene and mood for the coming showdown before resting on the main piece, the game board and battleground. And this is where we get into analysis territory. Let's start with the foundation, the game board. It contains 15 dark and light checkered fields, 5 columns and 3 lanes, on which players and rivals place their cards. On either side of the battlefield, an additional column of inset fields act as lane power indicators and represent the sum of power numbers of all allied cards in a respective lane. Let's break this down. Each card bears a number in its top right corner. This represents the card's power value. If the player places a card on a valid field, its power value is added to the power indicator in the lane's inset field on the player's side to the left. The same goes for the rival, just on the right side. In this clip, each opponent has one card placed on the battlefield, each bearing a power value of 2. This sets the lane power indicator on each side to 2 as well. If you look closely, the lane power inlet fields on each side also contain 2 chips each, the physical representation of a lane's power value. Besides this power value, a card has a few more elements to it, namely the pawn requirement, the card's reach, and affiliation. The player's cards have a blue background, while the rival's cards are tinted in deep crimson. Those colors thus distinguish between player and rival affiliation. As seen on the game board, some fields are occupied by 1 or even 2 pawns, some of them with a green and some of them with a crimson head, signifying their affiliation. Green for the player and crimson for the rival. Wait, isn't the player color meant to be blue? We'll get to that later. In the lower half, the card's reach is displayed in a 5x5 grid to possibly accommodate for 2 fields into each cardinal direction. The white square in the center signifies the card's position when placed on the game board, and the yellow squares define fields affected by the card. The Mu card also boasts a square with a red outline below the white center. This is a special effect field. Most cards have no abilities. As the security officer card's description in the English screenshot suggests, this card has no abilities. However, in the Japanese-only Tokyo Game Show trailer, the Mu card's description says the following. While this card is dealt, the power of the allied card in the special effects square is increased by 1. Which means that when placed on the game board, the power value of the card below Mu would increase by 1. Besides the red bordered square, that 3-star icon to the left of the Mu's range indicator might describe this specific ability, meaning each card ability might be represented by a different icon. The last element to talk about is the bowl in each dragon's hand. While its use is neither confirmed nor visible in the trailer, we can only see a single possibility. When all fields of a lane are occupied by cards, the chips lying in the inset field of the completed lanes are dropped into the dragon's bowl on each side. But how many and which ones exactly? Let's cover that in the next segment. With the basic elements of the game established, and the chain of events shown in the trailer, we can establish a nigh complete set of rules for this game. We already know that each card placed on the game board increases the power value of a lane, which contributes to the player's or rival's total score. Thanks to the presence of the chips and dragon bowls, we can assume that all chips collected from a lane move into the dragon bowl on the respective side once a lane is completely occupied. Once all 3 lanes are completed, the total amount of chips in each bowl are counted and the one with the higher value wins. At least, this is the simplest conclusion that Viz can come up with given the elements on screen, and making the least amount of assumptions. It's possible that only the one with the highest power value on a lane can collect the chips into the bowl, or that the lane winner receives all chips placed on either side of that lane. However, the latter 2 possibilities would throw off balancing by receiving either none or too many chips for a full lane. Only receiving what's placed on your own side will keep the game undecided and interesting until the final lane is completed. That's why there are 5 columns, an odd number, to force an imbalance of card affiliation on each lane, thus making the power value of each placed card essential to one's strategy. Speaking of, let's go into exactly that. Cards cannot be placed willy-nilly. As we see here, The security officer can be placed on all fields bordering on the Leprechaun card, as those are highlighted by a yellow border. Why? Because all of those fields have at least one green pawn placed on them, and the security officer card's pawn requirement is 1, as indicated in the top left. In this shot, the Mu card is selected, which has a pawn requirement of 2. Thus, it can only be placed on the field below the Leprechaun card, which contains 2 green pawns, as indicated by the yellow border around the valid field. We can see that the Mu card cannot be placed in the single pawn field, as indicated by the red invalid symbol on the card. Same goes for attempting to place it on another card already on the board, as we can see here. So much for the requirement of placing cards. What happens when you actually do place a card on the valid field? This is where the card's range comes into play. While hovering over a valid field to place the selected card on, green fields for the player are highlighted, which directly coincide with the yellow squares on the card relative to the white center. In the case of our Mu card, its range covers one field to the right and one diagonally to the top right. When comparing these two scenes together, we can also see that those two highlighted target fields each contain an additional green pawn. This is how we prepare empty fields to increase the number of valid fields for further cards to place on. Luckily, the game already shows us the effect of our action before we perform it, which is why the additional pawns are already displayed and the lane power indicator updated. When actually placing the card, pawn and lane power indicator becomes set in stone, as we can see here. Side note, the Mu's ability field, the red bordered square below the white center, has no effect here because there's no allied card below it to power up. It's not only the number of pawns on a field that define whether or not a card can be placed on the field, but also their affiliation color. As we can see, the rival cannot place the Grassland Wolf card on the top leftmost field, even though the pawn number requirement is met. This implies that if a field were to contain 2 green pawns and 1 crimson pawn, the rival would not be able to place a 2-pawn card on that field. But how do we know that the Grasslands Wolf has a pawn requirement of 1? The English screenshot provides us with that answer. The rival has placed a single card on the bottom rightmost field, which certainly does not already contain 2 pawns. While we don't see the Grassland Wolf's range anywhere, it at least has a yellow field on the left and one to the top, as we can see here. The field to its left now has 1 crimson pawn, and the field above it now contains 2. How can we deduce this? Looking at any other game state, each field on the leftmost and rightmost column each contain always at least a single pawn of the opponent's affiliation color. Here, we can see that the Leprechaun card, the selected one, has a pawn requirement of 1 as well. Going back to an earlier scene for clarity, we can see that the player has placed a Leprechaun card and the rival an Insectoid Chimera card, which must consequently have a pawn requirement of 1 as well. The Leprechaun's range is visible and coincides with the additional green pawns seen here. An additional pawn on the field below and the first one to the field to its right. To summarize, on their respective first turn, each opponent can place a card with a 1-pawn requirement on any field in the column closest to them. Each placed card increases the number of allied pawns on the fields in range by 1. This in turn means that foresight is key, as each card acts as a building block for your advances towards enemy territory and increasing your lane power value as far as possible. And that's basically it. Each turn, you need to assess which cards you can currently play and whether their range will beneficially prepare adjacent fields for your upcoming cards. For example, this sweeper card, called Junin Sweeper in Japanese by the way, is best placed in the center as it will only affect fields in the lanes above and below. The Alpha Dunk card, on the other hand, while having a high power value of 4, can only affect the fields above, below, and behind it, meaning it cannot prepare advancement as other cards. And as already covered, abilities and ability fields, like the one from the Mu card, increase the factors to consider in one's strategy dramatically. In essence, this minigame has just a few simple rules, yet seems to be highly strategical. Easy to learn, hard to master, so to speak. This covers the rules for and how to play this very enticing and intriguing looking card game. But that's not all we want to talk about. Viz already alluded to something strange earlier, the player's color scheme. Pawn heads and the lane power indicators on the game board bear the color green and remind of the live stream or even a green starry sky, but the card backgrounds are held in a sky blue. Why is that? The rival's color scheme is limited to a single color, deep crimson. No duality there. Then we have the castle, the 2 dragons, and the game's name to consider as well. Not to mention the whole side story arc tied to this card game, which spans the entirety of Rebirth. Anyway, enough teasing, let's get into it. What if the different colors on the player side actually represent 2 different entities, while the single colored rival represents only one? Rebirth's main key art, which also made its way onto the game box, could be the key to understanding the purpose of Queen's Blood. In the key art, we see the same colors as represented on the game board of Queen's Blood. Green for Cloud, sky blue for Zack, and crimson for Sephiroth. Cloud had to undergo Mako treatment, which resulted in Mako poisoning. Mako is the equivalent to the life stream, which is where he falls into after the events at the Northern Crater. Both the starry sky above the water tower during the promise scene, as well as Remake's box key art, are presented in a green tinge. Furthermore, Lifestream is made of memories, which are the combined experiences of all life forms that have ever lived on the planet. Cloud's main story arc revolves around false memories, which are caused by Mako poisoning, the trauma of Zack dying in his arms, and Genova cells. Zack has always been connected to the blue sky, as described in the Crisis Core Complete Guide keyword collection. The blue sky symbolizes Zack, the white feather Angeal, and the water Aerith. As with its use in the logo of Crisis Core, the blue sky symbolizes Zack, the ideal soldier first class envisioned in Final Fantasy VII. This is the image of Zack at his best and complete. If you pull back a bit, you could say it symbolizes ideals, goals, dreams. And as depicted in Crisis Core's logo, key art, and PSP box art. Lastly, Sephiroth is an embodiment of fire and flames, meteor, destruction, hatred, entities and concepts connected to the color red, or crimson. He also keeps stabbing and killing people, shedding their blood, which also bears the crimson color. Key art pieces of him from the original game, remake, and now Rebirth show Sephiroth among flames. Setting Nibelheim ablaze was the moment he turned into a monster. That's it for color references, but there's more. Why are pawns and lane power indicators bearing the green color, and not the cards? Plus, the player turn cut-in is also presented in blue, as is the rival turn tinged in the same crimson color as the rival's pawns, cards, and lane power indicators. Viz has a nice theory for you, and it fits rather well into the roles for Cloud, Zack, and Sephiroth. Cloud is Sephiroth's pawn in the latter's schemes. After all, he calls Cloud his everything, or master, as he puts it in the Japanese version. Plus, Sephiroth needs Cloud's strength, his infinite potential, as Chadley puts it.
But when we met, Cloud, I sensed something within you, something I knew would allow me to break free of my chains. By identifying and studying a subject with infinite potential such as yourself.
Zack, on the other hand, is his own person, the main protagonist, or player, of his story. He's actually fighting for something, to fulfill his dreams. He's not merely following Sephiroth's call, as Cloud does for the majority of the original story. However, Zack's story did not end in Remake. It continued, and still does in Rebirth. If Viz's assessment of the parallels between the player cards and pawns and Zack and Cloud is correct, Zack is only able to advance towards his goal if Cloud paves the way for him, according to the card game's rules. As for the rivals side, Sephiroth is literally Cloud's and Zack's rival. Furthermore, he can control his other pawns, the black-robed people, which he requires for the reunion. Just like Cloud for Zack, they pave the way for Sephiroth to advance towards his goals. But what is their goal? Let's turn our focus on this card minigame's name, Queen's Blood. It came quite out of left field as it contains very specific terms, but does not seem to have any connection to Final Fantasy VII, like Fort Condor does in Episode Intermission, which functions similarly in terms of progression and challenging opponents. Granted, names like Triple Triad and Tetramaster in Final Fantasy VIII and IX respectively also don't seem to have any connection to their game's lore. Or do they? Quick warning, there are going to be spoilers for Final Fantasy VIII and IX ahead, so feel free to skip ahead here if you don't want to hear those. In Final Fantasy VIII, there are 3 witches that we need to fight at some point: Edea, Adele, and Ultimecia. The succession of witches across time and space is a huge part of its story. Triple Triad could therefore be a reference to them. It could also be a neat reference to the Warring Triad from Final Fantasy VI, which consists of 3 magi, which in turn are also pivotal to its plot. In Final Fantasy IX's case, Tetramaster, meaning Master of 4, could refer to the 4 elemental guardians we have to fight in Memoria, the penultimate dungeon in the game: Kraken, Marlith, Lich, and Tiamat, which themselves are a reference to the 4 fiends in the very first Final Fantasy. Earlier in the game, the party splits up to visit the 4 elemental temples and defeat each temple's guardians, the ones I just listed, to retrieve the seal of each, which are needed to access the world of Terra. Unfortunately, most likely due to time and budget constraints, the developers had to turn that section of the game into a sequence of cutscenes instead of turning each temple into a dungeon with each temple's guardian as its boss encounter, which might be the reason for why they opted to move those encounters to a later point in the game. Alright, we're out of spoiler territory now. All this being said, it's entirely possible that Queen's Blood has a deeper meaning than just being a fitting name for the card game's medieval setting, the castle and the dragons. But what could it refer to? The lifestream is also called the lifeblood of the planet, which means that the term blood in the title could refer to exactly that, the lifestream, the planet's memories. Sephiroth wants to gain complete control over it to rule over the cycle of life himself so he doesn't vanish when the planet dies. Or, alternatively, to keep the planet from dying, basically keeping it on life support. On the other side, Zack and Cloud are opposing Sephiroth, and thus implicitly fight for the preservation of the lifestream and the natural cycle of life. If blood stands for lifestream, Queen may refer to either the planet or even Minerva, who follows the intentions of the lifestream, according to Crisis Core's Complete Guides keyword collection. It seems that the purpose behind her actions is to follow the intentions of the lifestream. Going further with this idea, at the end of the State of Play trailer from September 14th, 2023, Sephiroth says the following:
The reunion, when worlds merge.
Reunion, when worlds merge. We will cover this and so much more in a future video, but for the sake of this minigame analysis, let's focus on the very surface part of this. Ever since Zack's survival and remake, we are dealing with 2 worlds. One that resembles the original storyline and which we play through with Cloud and the others, and one where Zack lives, and Cloud is still catatonic, suffering from the effects of Mako poisoning. It seems that Sephiroth wants to merge both worlds in some way, and Viz believes that that's what will inevitably happen. It's just a question of which continuity or which world will prevail, and that's what those 2 dragons holding a bowl on each side might represent. 2 potential outcomes battling each other until only one of them prevails and claims the crown, which is beautifully represented in the card game's logo on the game board. But there is another possibility. We already established that the players and rivals card and pawn colors could refer to Cloud, Zack, and Sephiroth. It is therefore not at all far-fetched to think of Aerith as she's connected to all three. Zack is her first love, and she wants to find the real Cloud within. Plus, she's the last Cetra, and thus a major wrench in Sephiroth's plans given her abilities to commune with the planet. If Sephiroth kills her and somehow makes sure that she cannot call forth the lifestream as she did in the original game, he not only gains free reign, he also prevents her to find the real Cloud in one continuity and takes away the last person the now alive Zack cares about in the other. In the context of this minigame, he would win the crown by slaying the Queen, which would represent Aerith in this case. Being the last Cetra essentially makes her automatically Queen of the Cetra, as there's nobody else around. That's it for the Queen part. What about blood? It could refer to three things. 1. The life stream within Aerith. 2. Her heritage, the blood of the Cetra. Or 3. Her literal blood that spilled on the fated altar at the Forgotten Capital. Possibility number 3 holds some weight, considering Rebirth's stories going up to exactly that location and event as confirmed by the developers multiple times. I'll say that the locations covered in this game go up to the Forgotten Capital. One point being that the order of certain events of the storyline may differ from the original. Some may appear or some way than what happens in the original. But overall, Rebirth will tell the story to the Forgotten Capital sequence and overall follow the original story. When I asked what Rebirth's stopping point will be, Tetsuya Nomura confirmed that the story runs up to the end of the Forgotten Capital, aka the City of the Ancients. However, as anyone who finished Remake should know, Nomura stresses that Rebirth will not follow the events in the same order or manner as the original game. As you know, in Rebirth, the characters are leaving Midgar and going on a journey that eventually leads to the Forgotten Capital. The section of the original Final Fantasy VII story that Rebirth tells goes up to the Forgotten Capital. Although there are some changes in the order of the locations depicted in this title extend up to the Forgotten Capital, where the greatest fate of Final Fantasy VII awaits you. And then there's this segment from the official press release announcing the game's release date on February 29th. The story will unfold more dramatically than ever before, with a rapid pace of major twists and turns. We know fans are dying to see one scene in particular. If that's not a reference to Aerith's iconic video game death, we're not sure what is. To summarize, Queen's Blood either refers to the planet's lifestream, and possibly Minerva, or the heritage and eventual death of Aerith. Or both. But there's more. Remember this variant of Rebirth's key art, which is shown upon completing the Junin segment of the Tokyo Game Show demo? What if Queen's Blood refers to two individuals? Just as the player side is represented by two colors, which we deduced could refer to Zack and Cloud, Queen may in turn refer to two entities as well. Aerith and Tifa. How can Sephiroth permanently break Cloud? By removing Tifa from the equation. After all, it's her help that reverts Cloud to his true self, and thus breaks Sephiroth's hold over him. For a now alive Zack, Aerith is the last friend he still has left after Sephiroth, Genesis, and especially his mentor Angeal have died. Yes, Cloud is still alive in Zack's continuity, but he's still catatonic, and will most likely turn into yet another black-robed Sephiroth puppet. In short, Sephiroth aims to break both Cloud and Zack, and thus needs to get rid of Aerith and Zack's and Tifa and Cloud's continuity to achieve that in order to grab the crown and win. Zack and Cloud, on the other hand, only need to oppose and defeat Sephiroth, their rival, to avert the end of their world. All this crazy theorizing and pondering over possible connections to the main story sounds good and intriguing and all, but what about the minigame's presentation? Why the castle and the dragons? Final Fantasy VII contains neither element outside of the medieval theater play and Ghost Square at the Gold Saucer, a few dragon enemies, and Calm's architecture reminding of a castle. We don't think we can draw direct parallels to Final Fantasy VII's world, as the game's presentation might just be of allegorical nature. The castle may represent the Forgotten Capital, and the two dragons on both sides vying for the queen. One wants her blood, the other wants to save her. Although, when reading the last sentence of the official description again, it seems like both sides are out for blood and want to claim the queen's crown. Collect cards and utilize their abilities to claim the crown as QB royalty. Fizz generally thinks that this minigame has the role of an allegory. Remember it being a part of a side story which we uncover as we play and win against more and more rivals? That side story could mirror Rebirth's main narrative, but told in a completely separate story that, in itself, has nothing to do with Rebirth's plot. Unconnected, yet full of parallels and neat details if you know where to look. That's Viz's prediction anyway. It's just a minigame, bro. Chill and touch grass. We can hear some of you saying that already. And it's true. We may be reading way too much into this, as always. Queen's Blood could merely be a cool-looking minigame that enriches the experience of Rebirth. Nothing more. However, those curious details that we've just spent the last few minutes covering, like the player having differently colored cards and pawns compared to the unified color scheme of the rival, they're just too compelling to withhold our findings and theories, especially when there's a chance that Viz is onto something. Our final point is this. Queen's Blood is effectively on the same level of importance as side quests, since the world map shows how many rivals you've already beat in the region right next to the number of available and completed side quests. Plus, the Grasslands demo contains a more complete main menu where we can spot a separate entry for this minigame specifically. It's therefore heavily integrated into the main game and its progression, maybe even the story to some extent. Much more so compared to any other minigame so far. Is it February 29th yet? And that's it for Queen's Blood. All other 8 minigames revealed so far, Welcoming Ceremony March, Chocobo Racing, 3D Battler, G-Bike, Catch a Chocobo, Moogle Mischief, Chocobo Time Trial, and Piano Performance, will be covered in upcoming videos. So make sure to like this video if you appreciate our work, and subscribe to this channel to not miss out on future analysis videos. Are you hyped for Queen's Blood yet? Do you think we covered everything? What's your take on Queen's Blood being an allegory to Rebirth's story and mysteries? Please share your thoughts in the comments below or on our Discord server. You can also check us out on Twitter, or X, for more analysis content with the hashtag #CCOGems. Thank you so much for watching and take care. Kutakuma signing off.